I did not own the boots I stood in when they read my father's name off the claim and put another man's beside it. That was the 11th of October, 1887, in the land office at Carver's Bend on the high Dakota Plain, a low building that smelled of ink and cold stovepipe, and the clerk did not look up at me when he spoke. He said the patent had lapsed for want of the final proof and the residence months, and that the quarter section my father had broken with his own hands for 6 winters now belonged to the railroad's grant and to a man named Calvin Rourke who had the cash to file. I was 22 years old. I had buried my father in August under the one cottonwood he had planted, and I had nothing left of him but a tin box of his drawings and a knowledge that did not show on any ledger. What I did not yet understand, standing there in the borrowed boots with the cold coming up through the floor, was that the only thing they had not managed to take from me was the one thing that would carry me through the worst winter that country would ever see. Stay with me, because what they laughed at on the porch that fall is the reason I am here to tell it. The clerk slid the paper across, and I signed where he pointed, and I walked back out into a wind that came at a person like a landlord, come to collect. My father was Eli Voss, and he was an ice house man before he was a homesteader. In the river towns of Wisconsin, where I was born, he had cut and stored ice for the breweries and the butchers, packing the great blocks in sawdust and straw in low stone buildings dug half into the earth, and he had a feel for cold the way other men had a feel for horses. He used to say that cold was not a thing you fought, but a thing you herded, that you could not make a place warm by wishing, but you could keep the warm you had if you understood where it leaked away. He taught me with his hands more than his mouth. I was a girl of 6 or 7 the first time he took me down into the cutting house behind the brewery in the river town where we lived, and the heat outside that July day had been the kind that lay on a person like a wet wool blanket, and he led me down 3 stone steps into the dark and set my small palm flat against the inner wall and held it there. The cold came up into my hand like water rising. He told me to feel how the deep earth held one steady temper against all the heat above, and he said that the ground forgot the season if you went down far enough, that 4 feet under, the earth lived in a single long spring that no August and no January could reach. He showed me the blocks of river ice stacked to the rafters in their beds of sawdust, cut the winter before and still hard as iron in the heat of summer. And he made me understand that the ice did not stay because it was strong, but because the men who packed it understood where the warmth wanted to get in and had closed every door against it. The sawdust was not there to be pretty. The thick sod roof was not there for looks. Every part of that low, dark building was an argument with the heat, and the building was winning, and a child could feel it winning in the cold rising up through her hand. When the railroads brought cheap manufactured ice and the trade thinned, he took the homestead grant and brought me west, a widower with 1 daughter and a wagon of strange tools, and he broke ground on that quarter section and meant to prove it up and leave it to me. He did not finish. A fever took him fast in the late summer of 1887, 3 weeks of it, and at the end he was clear-eyed and calm in a way that frightened me more than raving would have. He had me sit by the bed in the soddy with the lamp turned low, and he made me fetch the tin box and open it on the quilt where he could touch the pages with one thin hand, and he told me to mind the drawings and to remember that the cave on the north line was not a flaw in the land but the best thing on it. There was an old ice cave there, a natural hollow in a limestone shoulder, where a cold spring had worked the rock for 1,000 years, and the homesteaders before us had thought it useless ground, too stony to plow and too damp to build on. My father thought otherwise. He had measured it across 2 full years and drawn it, and noted in his cramped hand the depth and the airflow and the temperature he took with a borrowed thermometer at different seasons, and he had found that the back of it stayed near 40 degrees in the heat of July and never froze even when the surface world went to iron in January. He told me that night that a man could winter in it on almost nothing if he understood it, and that he had meant to build it out for the two of us and had run out of summers. He squeezed my hand once and told me not to let them tell me the rocks were worthless. I did not understand the whole of it then. I only knew that he set great store by that hole in the rock, and that when he spoke of it, his voice changed the way a man's voice changes when he speaks of something he loves, and that I had better keep those pages dry whatever else I lost. When the claim passed to Rourke, the land office allowed me a small relinquishment, a narrow strip along the north line that the railroad did not want because the limestone shoulder ran through it and no plow could touch it. It held the ice cave and a half-acre of stone and scrub and a tumble-down soddy my father had used for storing tools. To the men of Carver's Bend, it was a joke that I had been left the one piece of the claim worth nothing, the rocks in the hole, while Rourke took the broken acres and the cottonwood and the good black soil, and I heard more than one of them say at the store that the girl had got what was coming to a family that put more stock in drawings than in plowing. I took it without argument, and I think that surprised them, because a person who does not argue is a person who knows a thing the arguers do not. I moved my few things into the soddy on a gray morning in late October, the tin box and the buffalo robe, and a chest of clothes and my mother's one, good kettle, and my father's dog, a brown shepherd mix named Tip, who had slept the foot of his bed and now slept at the foot of mine and would not settle until I let him. He went straight to the cave mouth that first day and stood looking into the dark of it with his ears up, as if he heard something in there I could not. And I have wondered since whether some animals know warmth the way they know a coming storm, in the body before the mind. That same week I began to do the thing that made the whole settlement decide I had lost my reason along with my father. I began to fill the ice cave with firewood, not a cord and not two, but every stick I could cut, beg, glean, or haul. I went out with Tip and a borrowed axe, and I worked the cottonwood breaks along the dry creek and the deadfall in the river timber 8 miles east, and I split and stacked and carried until my hands were a map of cracks and my back would not straighten of an evening. The cottonwood split clean when it was seasoned and fought me when it was green, and I learned to read a log by its check and its color and its weight in the hand, taking only what would burn dry and clean, leaving the rest. Some days I hauled 3 loads, and some days the snow turned me back with one, and through all of October and into the iron weeks of November I went out before light and came back after dark, and Tip ran the trace beside the wagon and flushed the rabbits I snared for the pot. I packed that seasoned wood into the cave in tight rows the way my father had packed ice blocks, butt to butt and course on course, leaving the channels he had drawn open between the stacks so the air could move where he wanted it to move. I banked the mouth of it with sod and stone the way he had banked his ice houses, cutting the sod in heavy squares from the slope margin and laying them grass down and tight, all but a low door barely high enough to stoop through, and a flue cut high through the rock and chinked with clay. The men hauled their fuel and stacked it in neat ricks against their north walls where everyone could see it, the way it had always been done, a man's winter wealth on plain display for his neighbors to measure. I carried mine down into the dark of the rock where no one could see it at all, and they made of that what men make of anything they do not understand. It was Calvin Rourke who gave the thing its name. He was a broad, easy man, not cruel in the way a wolf is cruel, but careless in the way a man is careless when he has never once been required to be wrong. And he stood on the porch of Albert Stein's store one Saturday in November with a half-dozen others and watched me drive my loaded wagon past toward the north line. He took the toothpick from the corner of his mouth and he said, loud enough to carry, that there went Voss's girl to feed her woodpile in a hole. The men laughed the comfortable laugh of men who agree with one another. Voss's woodpile in a hole. It fastened to me the way a burr fastens to wool. And for the rest of that autumn, I was the woman who buried her firewood, who kept it underground where the damp would rot it and the dark would waste it, who did not have the sense God gave a goose to stack it dry in the open air like a Christian. I heard it at the store, and I heard it at the well, and I heard children repeat it who did not know what they were saying. I did not answer it. My father had taught me that a thing answered too quick is a thing you are not sure of, and I was sure. What none of them stopped to ask was why a woman who had grown up in ice houses would do a fool thing with cold on purpose. They saw the wood going into the wet dark, and they thought of rot. They did not think of the spring that ran cold through the back of that cave, nor of the channels I had left open between the rows, nor of the way my father had drawn arrows in the tin box pages to show how cold air, being heavy, would settle and pool and creep along the floor, while the warm rose and held above it. I was not storing firewood to keep it dry. The cave kept it dry enough, the limestone wicking the damp away into the rock the way my father had measured it would. I was doing something else, something he had worked out across a lifetime of moving cold from one place to another, and had drawn for me in his last good month, and I will tell it as it came, in its own time, the way the winter told it to the men who laughed. I want to say plainly what I had, because the having of it is the whole of this story. I had no money. I had $11 and some coin in a sock, and a strip of stony ground, and a dog, and a tin box of a dead man's drawings. The only inheritance my father left me was the kind that lives in the hands and behind the eyes, the knowing of how cold behaves and where warmth goes when it leaves a room. And in that country, in that year, it was worth more than the deed Rourke carried in his coat. I did not know yet how much more. I knew only that the work felt right under my hands the way my father's lessons had always felt, right before I had the words for them, and that the cave, when I stood in its mouth at dusk with the lantern, breathed out a steadiness that the open prairie never had. The drawings were the heart of it. In the tin box, my father had left a dozen pages of careful pencil, elevations and sections of the cave with measurements taken at different seasons, and a long set of notes in his cramped hand about the principle he was working toward. He had not lived to build it, but he had thought it whole. The cave ran back perhaps 40 feet into the limestone shoulder and dropped as it went, so the deep end sat well below the mouth, and the cold spring fed a thread of water along the lowest channel. My father's notion, drawn and figured and proven against the readings he had taken, was that a person could live in the upper chamber through the hardest winter on almost no fuel, because the deep earth held its 40 degrees against the back wall like a stove that never went out, and because the banked mouth and the low door and the high flue made a chimney of the whole hollow, drawing the killing cold down and out along the floor channel, while the small warmth of a single fire and a single body and a single dog rose and gathered and stayed. The firewood was not for a roaring blaze. It was a reserve against the longest siege, stacked deep so it would not need fetching in a storm that might last a week, and stacked in the cave so it would be bone dry and ready and close to hand when the open ricks of the prairie froze under 4 feet of drift and could not be reached at all. I built through November and into December. I cut a sleeping shelf into the upper chamber with a mattock and squared it with a hand adze, and laid it with straw and my father's buffalo robe. I set a small sheet iron stove against the inner wall and ran its pipe up through a fissure I chinked tight with clay, and I learned by trying which way the draft wanted to run and chinked and opened until the cold air slid down and away along the floor as my father's arrows had promised, and the warm held at the height of my shoulders where I worked. It took me a week of small fires and a wetted finger held in the dark to find the chinking right, opening the flue a thumb's width here and closing the door gap there until the candle flame at floor level leaned outward toward the door, and the candle flame at shoulder height stood straight and still. That was the proof I worked by, the behavior of a flame in the dark, the same proof my father had used in his ice houses, the warm staying where the warm belonged and the cold finding the door. Tip learned the place better than I did. He found the warm pocket along the inner shelf and made it his, and he would not be coaxed out of it of an evening. And I took that as the surest reading I had, that the principle was sound, because a dog knows where the warmth is the way water knows where down is. I brought in barrels of water from the spring before it could freeze at the mouth, and dried meat hung from pegs driven into the rock, and the last of my father's potatoes banked in sand, and a sack of cornmeal, and I made that hollow in the rock into a place a person could winter. The men who saw the smoke from the high flue thought I was burning my buried wood for warmth in a damp hole and pitied me or laughed, depending on their natures, and Rourke at the store said a second time, in December, now, with the first hard cold settled on the country, that he hoped Voss's woodpile in a hole was keeping her toes warm, and the men laughed again, and I bought my salt and my thread and went home to the rock. I should tell you about Perlindal, because he is the reason any of this was written down and not just remembered. He was a young surveyor out of Yankton, sent up that fall to run the section lines for the railroad's grant, a careful, quiet Norwegian with a transit and a field book and a habit of writing down everything he saw, whether it bore on his work or not. He came to the North Line in early December to set a corner, and he found me banking the cave mouth with the last of the sod, and instead of laughing, he set down his transit and watched a while, and then he asked questions. He asked why the flue was set high and the door set low. He asked about the spring and the depth and the drawings, and when I brought out my father's tin box and opened it on the tailgate of the wagon, he went still over those pages the way a man goes still over Scripture. He turned them one by one in the cold light and read my father's notes and traced the arrows with a gloved finger. And he asked if he might copy some of the figures into his field book, and I told him he might. He said he had read of such things in the old countries, of houses dug into the hillsides of Norway that held their warmth against the northern winters, buyer and family, and all under one banked roof of earth. But he had not seen the principle worked out so plain on the open American plain, and he said it quietly, the way a man speaks when he has come on something he did not expect to find. He asked if he might come back in the new year and to see how it held through a hard cold. I said he might. I did not know that his field book would be the thing that carried my father's drawings out into the world after the winter had proved them, nor that a careful man's habit of writing down what he sees would outlast every porch and every laugh in that county. The cold came on slow at first, the way the worst things often do, a hardening through late December that froze the sloughs and stilled the creeks and put a rim of frost on the inside of every window in Carver's Bend. The men were not worried. They had wintered there before, and they had their ricks of wood stacked high against their north walls and their stock in their barns and their families banked in around their stoves, and they had no reason to think this winter different from the last. I read it differently, though I kept my reading to myself. My father had taught me to watch the deep signs, the way the cattle in Rourke's lot stood with their tails to a wind that had not yet risen, the way the cold settled and did not lift. In the mornings, the way the sky in the southwest took on a flat, hard color, like the bottom of a skillet. I came into Stein's store on the 10th of January for lamp oil, and Rourke was there by the stove with his boots up, and he saw me and he grinned and said it the third time, easy as breathing, that here came the woodpile in-a-hole woman herself, and asked the men whether they reckoned her firewood had drowned yet down in all that damp. The men laughed, because the cold made them want to laugh at something, and I paid Stein for my oil and said nothing, and I felt the laugh follow me out the door into a stillness that had a weight to it I did not like. On the 11th of January, 1888, 3 months to the day, from the morning they read my father's name off the claim, I brought Tip in early and barred the low door and banked the stove and waited, because everything in me that my father had filled said that the country was about to be judged. It came at midday on the 12th, and it came as a wall. The morning had been almost mild, deceptively soft, warm enough that the school children across that whole plain had walked to their schoolhouses in light coats, and the men had gone out to their stock without their heavy gear, and then in the space of minutes the southwest sky stood up black, and the temperature fell off a cliff. The storm that the newspapers would later call the schoolchildren's blizzard came down out of the north on a wind that drove fine snow flat as buckshot, and the cold that rode behind it was a cold the oldest men in that country had never measured. The thermometer at the store, before the glass cracked, stood at 40 degrees below zero. The wind did not gust so much as lean, a steady, murderous pressure that found every seam in every wall and pried the warmth out of every house in the county and flung it into the dark. Men who stepped out to their barns 10 yards off lost the house in the white and wandered and did not come back. The drifts climbed the north walls and buried the ricks of wood that every prudent family had stacked in the open, and a man who went out to fetch an armload could not find his own woodpile under 6 feet of driven snow, and could not have stood in that wind long enough to dig it out if he had. Down in the rock, I felt the storm as a change in the breathing of the cave. The high flue moaned, and the draft along the floor quickened, the heavy killing cold sliding in at the low door and running down the channel and out, exactly as my father had drawn it, while the warm from my small fire in my body and Tip's body rose and held in the upper chamber at the level of the sleeping shelf. I did not need a roaring fire. That was the thing the men could never have guessed, the thing my father had spent his life learning. I fed the little stove a few sticks at a time from the deep, dry reserve I had carried down all autumn, and the 40-degree back wall of the deep earth held its steady temper against my spine like a banked hearth that no storm could reach, and between the earth's warmth below and behind, and the small fire's warmth gathered above, the chamber stayed near 60 degrees while the world outside fell to 40 below. 90 degrees of difference, my father's whole life's knowledge standing in that gap, and Tip stretched on the warm shelf and sighed in his sleep as if it were an ordinary night. The storm held for 3 days, and the deadly cold for 2 weeks after. When the wind first dropped on the 15th, I dug up through the drift at the low door with the spade I had kept inside for exactly that, and I came up into a changed and terrible world, a white silence where the prairie had been, the drifts standing in long, hard waves where the wind had carved them, the sky a pale, exhausted blue. I will tell you what I found, because the arithmetic of it is the only honest way to say what that winter meant. In the county that took in Carver's Bend, 230-some souls were lost in that storm, and the cold behind it, a great part of them children caught between schoolhouse and home, and many a grown man within sight of his own door. The Halverson family 3 miles west burned their chairs, and then their table, and then the floorboards pried up one by one, and they lost the youngest. Anyway, when the wood ran out on the 2nd day, and the cold came into the house like a tide that would not be turned, old Sorensen, who had stacked 9 cords against his north wall and counted himself the richest man in fuel in the township, found his whole rick under a drift the height of his barn, and could not reach a stick of it, and he froze his feet to the bone trying. The Stein store stood empty and frozen, It stove cold for want of fuel a man could carry to it through that wind. Side by side, the numbers told the only sermon that winter preached. They had stacked their wood high and dry in the open where the storm could bury, past all reaching, and the storm buried it. And on the north line, in a hollow of limestone, the whole county had laughed at. One woman and one dog had passed the worst 2 weeks that country ever knew on less than a third of a cord of wood, warm the entire time, never once in danger, the buried reserve scarcely touched. I had wood enough left to winter twice over. I had water and meat and meal. The chamber had not once fallen below 56 degrees while the world outside lay at 40 below, and the thing they had named a folly had been the only warm place for 10 miles, and I had not even been cold. They began to come on the 16th, the ones who could still travel, gaunt and frostbitten and quiet, because word moves even across a frozen country that there is one place the cold did not take. I took them in. I did not say a word about the porch or the laughing. I built the little fire up, only a little, because the cave did the rest, and I made room on the floor of the chamber, and I fed them from my stores, and at the worst of it I had 14 people and 3 dogs, and a sucking calf sheltered in that hollow my father had measured, all of them warm, while the open ricks of the Prudent froze solid under the drifts not a mile away. Calvin Rourke came on the 18th. He had lost stock, and he had nearly lost a hand, and he had buried 2 neighbors with his own broken fingers, and he stood at the low door of the cave with the white waste at his back and the amber light of the chamber on his face, and he looked down the warm length of that hollow at the peeps sleeping safe on the straw. And he did not have his toothpick, and he did not have his porch, and he did not have anything at all to say for a long moment. Then he took off his hat in the doorway the way a man takes off his hat in a church, and he looked at me, and his voice when it came was not the porch voice. "You kept the cold out of the ground," he said. That was all. 4 words from a man who had laughed at me twice in front of his friends, and he meant by them the whole of what he had failed to understand, and I let the silence hold after them, and did not fill it because some accounts are settled best in quiet. He stood another moment in the warm. Then he came in out of the cold like all the rest, and I made him room. I have thought across all the years since about that moment, and about how the man I might have been forgiven for hating stood bareheaded in my doorway, and named the thing right at last, and how the naming cost him and how he paid it. He did not leave that winter the same man. When the thaw came in April, and the country counted its dead and its living and began the long work of going on, it was Rourke, as much as anyone who carried the word of what the cave had done, who told it at the store where he had once laughed, who said to any man who would listen that Eli Voss's daughter had known a thing none of them knew, and had tried to tell them with her work all autumn, while they laughed. He did not make himself small in the telling, which is not a thing the proud find easy, and he did not ask me to make him feel better about it, which is the rarer grace. He asked instead to learn. By the next autumn, there were 4 families in that county digging into the hillsides, and the limestone shoulders the way my father had drawn, and I walked them through the figures and the channels, and the high flue and the low door, and I gave the knowing away as freely as it had been given to me, because my father had taught me that knowledge hoarded rots faster than firewood, and knowledge shared is the only kind that lasts. Not all of them got it right at first, and the getting it wrong taught me the last thing my father's drawings had to teach. 2 families dug their hollows and stacked their wood and cut their doors and could not understand, when the next hard cold came, why their caves ran damp and chill while mine ran dry and warm. They had copied the form and missed the principle. The Bjorklund brothers had cut their door, and their flue at the very same height, so the cold could not run down and out and pool away along a floor channel, and the chamber filled with a standing chill no fire could push back. Another man had dug his hollow shallow and flat, never below the frost line, so he had no deep earth to be his stove and only cold rock at his back. They had seen me bank a mouth and cut a high flue, and they had done the same with their hands, and none of it with their understanding, and the cold found them out, as surely as it had found out the prudent men with their buried ricks. I went to each of them and I showed them. I made them feel the floor draft with a wetted hand and watch the candle flame lean, and I made them dig deeper until they struck the steady earth, and I told them what my father had told me, that the deep ground was the true stove, and the fire was only its servant, and that a man who did not understand which was master would freeze beside a full woodpile. Once they understood the why and not only the what, their hollows held as mine did. Per Lindahl came back that second winter with his field book as he had said he would, and he wrote it all down properly, the elevations and the sections and the principles stated plain, and he sent his account to the Territorial Agricultural Office at Yankton, and in time it was printed in a bulletin that went out to homesteaders across 3 territories under a dry official heading that did not have my father's name on it or mine. It did not need our names. It had the thing itself, the knowing, set down where the cold could not reach it and the laughing could not touch it, carried out into the world the way my father had carried cold from a river to a butcher's larder all his working life, from the place it was to the place it was needed. I lived a long time on that strip of stony ground they had thrown me as a joke. I married a man who had been one of the 14 sheltered that first winter, a steady, quiet man who had learned not to mistake a loud opinion for a true one. And we raised our children in a proper house we built above the cave, and we used the cave still, for ice in summer as my father had first meant it, and for shelter in the worst of winter as he had finally dreamed it, and Tip slept by our hearth to the end of his good long days, and is buried under the cottonwood beside my father, which is where I will go to when my time comes. Calvin Rourke became, of all the unlikely things, my nearest neighbor and my children's honorary uncle, and he dug the deepest and best figured hollow in the whole county, and he never once in the rest of his life let a man laugh at a thing he did not understand without saying, mild and easy from his own porch now, that he had laughed at a woodpile in a hole one time, and had been wrong as a man can be. The cave is still there. I am old now, and I have watched the county fill and change and bury its first generation and raise its third, and I have watched the railroad that took my father's acres go to rust in places, and I have watched 100 winters come down off the north and lean on the houses of that plain. The hollow my father measured holds its 40 degrees yet, summer and winter, the way the deep earth forgets the season, the cold spring still threading its thin cold water along the lowest channel where he drew it. On the worst nights, when the wind stands up black in the southwest, and the cold comes down with that old murderous patience, I think of him setting my small girl's palm against the icehouse wall in Wisconsin, and telling me the ground lived in one long spring, and I think how the thing he could not finish finished itself through my hands, and how the men who laughed grew old telling their grandchildren about the warm hollow in the rock, as though they had believed in it all along. They had not. They had laughed. The earth settled it, the way the earth settles everything in the end, slow and sure and without a single word, and the warmth my father taught me to keep is still down there in the dark of the rock, banked against the deep wall, holding steady through every storm that ever was or will be, waiting, the way it always was, for the night it would be needed.